Hello, everyone, and welcome to Alta Journal's California Book Club. It's a thrill to be here tonight for Gary Snyder as we talk about the practice of the wild and Riprap and Cold Mountain. In fact, it's a real honor to be here. Let me just say that straight up. Tonight, as usual, John Freeman will be the host, and we're joined by just an amazing roster of special guests, including Peter Coyote, Shuck, Brenda Hillman, Jack Shoemaker, Jane Hirshfield, Robert Haas, Rick Bass, Wang Ping, and Will Hearst. My name is Blaise Zuriga. I'm Alta Journal's editorial director, and I'm zooming in tonight from San Francisco, and I encourage everyone to post in the chat where they're joining from. And in the meantime, while you do that, let me get some housekeeping out of the way. Tonight's California Book Club is our free monthly gathering featuring books that reflect the wonderful diversity and humanity of life in the Golden State. We are an award-winning quarterly journal for arts and culture. Every issue we have poetry, fiction, original essays, reported pieces. We think of culture as writ large, from technology to science to history. And in the weeks leading up to each of our book club events, we post online free essays about that month's selection. And I encourage everyone, if you haven't visited, to go and read them. We've got great essays by our California Book Club editor, Anita Felicelli, Hamilton Kane, John Freeman, and we even ordered a special cocktail. Maybe if some of you saw that recipe, you can be sipping that tonight. It's a gin and tonic. It's a spin on the gin and tonic. So I encourage you to look at that. And if you join California Book Club, it's free. Like tonight, you'll get newsletters. We also have several other newsletters. Trust me, sign up for them. We have a weekly Monday book review. We serialize long form stories. We just have a lot going on. And so visit our website. And this club would not be possible without the amazing support of our partners, the Los Angeles Public Library, the San Francisco Public Library, the Huntington USC Institute on California in the West, Book Passage, Book Soup, Vroman's, Diesel, a bookstore, Books Inc., Green Apple Books, Bookshop West Portal, Narrative Magazine, and Ziziva. So please support our partners. Visit one of our indies, and if you don't have a copy yet of one of Gary's books, please go out and purchase it. And you too can support the work we do here at Alta Journal by becoming a member. You just visit altaonline.com. For $50 a year, you can get this big, beautiful, oversized print publication, as well as, this is a special offer, it's ending soon, a hat. There we go, a hat, and our best bookstores guide. This is an $18 value. It's really, really phenomenal. Keep it in your glove box and go visit all the bookstores up and down the coast. Or you can become a digital member for $3 a month. And please check out our store, altaonline.com. There's a store. We introducing a new tote, calling this one the Didion, as well as, of course, our crowd favorite California Book Club tote bag. And there's lots of cool merch. So please check that out. And if you can support us, we'd be honored. We greatly appreciate that. I think that's it. So without further ado, let me turn this over to our host, my good friend, John Freeman. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Blaise. It's good to see everybody piling in from Tasmania, Kathmandu, and quite a few from Grass Valley this episode of the California Book Club. The whole idea behind this club was to try to focus on beautiful and important works of writing that had come out of California, that were classics right in front of our eyes, that had changed the way we live and think. And I can think of no one more that has done that than the person we're here to honor and talk about, Gary Snyder. You might be here because he's awakened you, or maybe he's challenged you, maybe he's delighted you in his work, maybe you felt comforted by it. But whatever he is, poet, pacifist, practitioner of the wild, teacher, seeker, great listener to stories, especially those of Indigenous people, writer, essayist, ecological activist, from the person who has grown up in the Seattle Public Library reading the works of the great ancient Chinese and Japanese poets to the ones he's translated, he has spent a life, basically, as Robert Haas, who is joining us here tonight, thinking hard about our residence on Earth. He's the author of more than 24 books, and they have changed the way we live, the way we think. And it's a huge honor to welcome him here to talk about two of them, Riprap and Practice of the Wild. Please join me in welcoming Gary Snyder.
Pleasure to be here. The first thing I want to say about riprap is be sure you know what the word means, because it's just barely in the dictionary, and yet it's a commonly heard word in the backcountry. We still have, with our English language takeover of the Western coast, a number of words in vocabularies that belong to the work of the woods, and that people who don't work in the woods never hear them. So riprap, for no good reason at all, refers to the rough, unpredictable, rocky landscape of the mountains. And it tells you what gets in the way, what you have to get out of the way, and what you can't get out of the way. And it's all very entertaining. And it was the discovery in my labors up in the mountains of this word that pushed me to find the poems that I thought might go with it. And it's true. There are not many poems in the English language of the West Coast that do exactly that. And I'd like to read a poem from Riprap, if I might.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Milton by Firelight. Oh hell, what do mine eyes with grief behold? A quote from Milton. Working with an old single-jack miner who can sense the vein and cleavage in the very guts of rock, can blast granite, build switchbacks that last for years under the beat of snow, thaw, mule hooves. What use, Milton, of a silly story of our lost general parents, eaters of fruit? The Indian, the chainsaw boy, and a string of 6 mules came riding down to camp, hungry for tomatoes and green apples. Sleeping in saddle blankets under a bright night sky, the Han River, the Milky Way, slantwise by morning, jays, squall, coffee, boils. In 10,000 years, the Sierra will be dry and dead, home of the scorpion, ice-scratched slabs and bent trees. No paradise, no fall, only the weathering land, the wheeling sky, man with his Satan scouring the chaos of the mind. Oh, hell. Fired down, too dark to read now. Miles from a road, the bell mare clangs in the meadow that packed dirt for a fill-in, scrambling through loose rocks on an old trail, all of a summer's day. You're welcome to be angry or bored or puzzled by such a poem.
It's wonderful to hear you read it. I wondered if I could ask you what you learned about your place in the world by working among miners and people that were logging. It seems sometimes counterintuitive for someone who cared so much about the wild.
It's all wild. Are you making a distinction between the wild and what?
No, I mean, as someone who cares about the preservation of the wild, to work among miners and loggers, I wonder what you learned.
I learned to love the wild. And
Excellent.
that's what you have to do, in a way. You have to be part of it, part of the time. You have to know what the tools are. You have to talk to the people who have worked in it. The Forest Service, a guy with a graduate degree in firefighting, can give you can organize your volunteer group and know how to go about responding to a little spot fire. But none of that is valuable ultimately if you don't know what's underneath it. And what's underneath it is this very ground itself, with all kinds of life in it that is constantly expanding and moving, and you should be at home with it. You know, so that's what I'm saying there over and over again is in the Riprap poems is take a look at the rocks.
It's wonderful. It feels, reading the poems now, that you are describing yourself on the verge of a great change. You know, you want to leave. You know, you want to go far, even further away. Did you feel that as you were writing them?
I don't think so. No, it was just, except that I would have wanted to go farther and higher, yeah. But it was you know, I learned a lot about not just rocks, but about horses, and about older people, and about cooking over an open fire with a tin cup to get your coffee. The kind of thing that my grandparents, your grandparents, did and knew, that are not understood or known or even imagined today, oddly.
Yeah, my grandmother went to school on a horse, and I did not.
That's well, think about it, because it may be more profound than one thinks in some ways. You know, the horses are kind of lonely now.
Yes. I wonder if, since you wrote about having chickens at your house and you no longer do because it was not practical, which animals around you where you live are you closest to?
Now,
Yes.
human beings.
So you,
And yeah, domestic cats. Domestic cats have a lot to tell you, as I found out steadily. And dogs, of course. And talking to dogs that aren't your own dog when they come by and have a chat with them. And then they go on.
it's one of my favorite things is to greet a dog. Most of them are up for it. I wonder now if we could pause our conversation so I can bring on Peter Coyote to talk a little bit about Zen and your work. Peter, you've been in the audience. I think many of the people here listening have heard your voice before in one of the over 150 films you've been in, or the most recent, I think, might be you doing the voiceover for Buffalo, the Ken Burns special. It's an honor to have you here. You came across Gary Snyder's work in the 1960s, and did it lead you to Zen?
Oh, before that, I was born in 1941, and at that time, Jews were not yet white people, and a lot of my relatives were communists and socialists, and I watched the McCarthy period swathing through my community and grown-ups crying in my living room, and I had a lot of anger. I couldn't go around with my friends to the country club around the corner. That's the kind of thing a 10-year-old and 11-year-old thinks about. By the time I was 12, I started reading the Beats, and they were the first grown-ups that gave me an armature to hang some of my thoughts and ideas around. And they all seemed to be interested in Zen and Buddhism. They talked a lot about it. And so I ran into Gary Snyder's name. Flash forward to California in the 1960s. And I lived for a while with Lou Welch, who was an old friend of Gary's, who set up a meeting. And there was something about Gary that I couldn't quite fathom. But I knew that this guy, if anyone knew anything about Zen and living, it was him. And I resolved to learn from him. And growing up on a farm, I'm handy with tools. And so I started going up to his place in the Sierras. And I got an idea of what a secular Zen life might look like. And I liked it. And 50 years later, I'm an ordained priest and a transmitted teacher. And because of that, I've been handed the unenviable position of describing Buddhism's role in Gary's work, which is like talking to humans about oxygen. So I'm assuming that not everybody is a Buddhist. So I'm going to give a really quick primer that Buddha discovered that everything in the universe was interconnected and interdependent. And because of that interdependence, you couldn't say that anything had a fixed and permanent self. That was a pretty radical thing to understand. If you look at your own being, you can't tell me what color yourself is, where it's located, what shape it has. And there's a great freedom in that, because what it means and what Buddha taught us was that everything is impermanent. And this world is full of affliction, which is the energy that keeps things moving, stirring the pot, as Gary once called it. And the impermanence is actually where our freedom arises. If we had a fixed self, we couldn't change. And so Buddhist practice is also tied to an ethical system, teaching us how to live in this interdependent world in a kindly, generous, non-stingy way, how to model our lives after the life of a Buddha. And we do that by meditating and going deeply into the mind, beyond the perimeters of the self, to get some sense, some intuition of the vastness of the world out there. And by repeated practice, we begin to dwell more and more permanently in that mind. And you learn a couple of things, which I always get from Gary's poems. One is that if we disregard the ego for a minute, what our nature is the nature of the universe. It's a vast, pregnant energy that's constantly extruding itself as the multiple forms of the world. I think about standing on a cliff and looking at an ocean full of peaked little waves rising and falling. And each of those waves could stand for a named thing in the universe. And they come out of the formlessness of the ocean and they assume shape for a while, and then they go back in the ocean. And when they have a shape, we call them living. And when they go back to the ocean, we say they're dead. But what those little waves forget, and what we forget, is that they've never for an instant not been part of the ocean. And so it's not like oxygen and pollinating insects and water and sunlight are there to keep us alive. They are our life. Our life is inextricable from those things. And so to begin to live in the world as comfortably as we live with the vagaries of the self and our envies and aggressions and all of that stuff, to begin to live in the world as one interdependent organism requires a lot of practice. And the sort of the first step of it is to admit that you're not one of the good guys, that nature itself is half negative and half positive, and your human nature will encompass the potential to be any other human act. You can be Buddha, you can be Jesus, you can be Mother Teresa, you can be Hitler, you can be Donald Trump. And if you don't know that, you're actually very dangerous. If you come to the conclusion that you're one of the good guys, you wind up dropping bombs on hotels in Baghdad in the middle of the night because your leader doesn't like their leader. So one of the reasons we meditate and one of the reasons we practice mindfulness is to make sure that the shadow sides of our nature don't get past our teeth and don't excite our muscles. We call it a practice because we fumble over and over again. Anyway, Gary's work is so imbued with those values that I actually can't extricate them. He's lived a life. He lived 9 years in a Buddhist monastery, but he's lived a life continuing that examination, pushing past the egoic boundaries, looking at the relationships between animals, species, terrain, people, politics. And a couple of the contributions that he made, I think, might be even more important than his poetry. Although as an artist, that was the first contact I had with him, and that's what I continue to revere. One of the things I also learned from Gary was that for many, many centuries, Buddhism existed under the permission of the king or the emperor or the shogun. And as such, it always had political compromises to make. It really didn't push or think too much about all the implications of freedom when it came to ideas and concepts that might upset the emperor. And here we are in the West, and we have this golden opportunity because for the first time, we can look at Buddhism within the whole political context. And we can look at our politics through this prism of kindness, of generosity, of interdependence. I mean, what does it mean when Americans stand by and allow other Americans to be deprived of their constitutional rights and don't step forward on their behalf and demand of their government that their citizenship should guarantee them equal protections, equal access? So these are the things that Gary and Robert Aitken with Engaged Buddhism began to take on in the West. And these are the particular paths that excited me. They seem consistent with the ethics of kindness and inclusion. If we remember that Buddha was the first to bring women into the practice, he brought Dalits into the practice. He didn't recognize caste and status. And so I think that as Buddhists, we're responsible to mimic that model. And as we go through life, the final of the Four Noble Truths is Marga, is the path. And on that path is where we model the life of a Buddha. And we do that by looking at our speech, our consciousness, our energy, our occupations, deep in our inner nature, looking to intuit from our deep nature the correct way to be in the world. And as we do that, we hope to develop and model a noble and dignified life which is helpful to other people. And to me, that's what Gary has done in his life. That's what he's done in his art. And the constant inclusion of overriding supposedly contradictory boundaries. I had to laugh. The miner is not separate from the love of wilderness. Cutting a trail is not separate from the love of wilderness. Drinking whiskey is not separate from being a Buddhist. The Dalai Lama has now been prescribed meat in his diet for his health. So we live in a boundaryless world, and what organizes our activity has to be intuitions, because we can never think our way through. And those intuitions need to be refreshed by constant meditation and constant plunging into our inner depths and remembering that everything has an equal standing. I may not like the fact that I'm made of the same stuff as Donald Trump, but he has equal standing to exist. And my task is to figure out some way to either protect the weak or understand what circumstances and uprisings he had. Maybe if my father was a Ku Klux Klan guy, I might be like Donald Trump. But we're both indelibly human. We both have a human role to play. And I trust Buddhism as a reliable map to discover it. And I don't know, that's 9 minutes. So I think maybe that's enough, and we'll hear what someone else has to say.
Thank you so much, Peter. Impermanence is where our freedom lies is a very liberating idea. I want to ask one question of Gary Snyder on the back of those 9 minutes, which is, Gary, do you still meditate daily? And how has your practice changed in that way over time?
It hasn't changed much. And I must say, the best part or the earliest part of a practice that taught me something was working on trails. Since I learned that you have to pay attention to what you're walking on, and nothing can be said to be in the way. So there you go.
Thank you. We're going to bring on some poets now. Kim Shuck, who is the poet laureate of San Francisco and the author most recently of Deer Trails. Brenda Hillman, who is a poet and translator and author of 10 collections, also winner of the California Book Award. And Jack Shoemaker, who I think should be called an honorary poet because he's published so much poetry at this point. Bookseller, publisher, founder of the North Point Press, which published in its original form The Practice of the Wild, as well as Counterpoint Press, as well as Shoemaker and Horde, and the relaunched Counterpoint Press. And I think the best way to go back into this is to maybe read a poem, since we've been hearing about going up trails. Brenda, do you want to read one?
Yes, sorry for my voice here. Hello, everyone. Welcome. So happy to be here. I'm going to read Riprap, and I have a few words to say about it, and we'll talk about it. Riprap. Lay down these words before your mind like rocks, placed solid by hands in choice of place, set before the body of the mind in space and time. Solidity of bark, leaf, or wall, riprap of things, cobble of Milky Way, straying planets. These poems, people, lost ponies with dragging saddles and rocky, surefoot trails. The world's like an endless four-dimensional game of Go. Ants and pebbles. In the thin loam, each rock a word. A creek-washed stone, granite, ingrained with torment of fire and weight, crystal and sediment, linked hot, all change in thoughts as well as things. I have so much to say about this, but I'd love to hear, I don't know, John, if you want me to speak about it or...
I'll come back to you in 1 second, because I think that poem, it almost leads us into a state of meditation. I've been reading it every day the last 30 days, and you can almost feel your body change as you read it and your mind slow down and contemplate the actual meanings of words. And Jack Shoemaker, you published Gary Snyder over, I think, almost 50 years or close to it. And I wonder if you can tell us about the first time you heard that poem being read aloud, and whether that was your introduction to Gary or if it came in a different way.
Thank you, John. I'd love to. Can you hear me? Am I on?
Yes.
It's a cliche to say that books can change your life, but I'm the very embodiment of that deep truth. In a small town high school on the central coast of California, a young teacher suggested that I read Walden. I was being offered, I see now, some source of authority. Not long after that, I read Riprap by Gary Snyder. Or more to the point, I heard Gary Snyder read Riprap at one of the first poetry readings I'd ever attended in Isla Vista, of all places. If memory serves, he led off with that poem. That evening, Gary had the straight-ahead physical posture of an Olympic wrestler. Legs spaced apart, shoulders aligned, an upright confrontational attitude with a blunt breath control that precisely mimicked his physical stance. It was a presentation of assurance and intention, and he enjoyed a mastery of silence I'd never experienced before in a performance. The reading of that poem, Riprap, exactly described the action of the poem itself. I've never been able to read Gary on the page without recalling that voice. The poem in that incredible collection and the others he read that evening, especially A Berry Feast, began to assemble in my mind an agenda, a sort of devotion, and one that has guided me for 60 years. Riprap is a collection of poems about work and occupation, a mixture of common and exotic location, and yet it is all grounded in a common American speech that one might finally call Western. It is almost as if William Carlos Williams had grown up reading Chinese landscape poems while hiking and working in the Pacific Northwest. I quickly added Robinson Jeffers and Kenneth Rexroth to the mix, and I had my poetics of the Pacific Edge, one that has occupied me ever since. But Gary Snyder was the key.
Oh, Jack, thank you so much for that. It's so nice to hear you highlight the fact that these are poems of work and occupation. Before we go to Kim, I want to come back to you, Brenda, just what it means to write poetry sonically about work, and if that means anything to you in the context of the tight syllabics and the beautifully controlled but open syntax of Riprap itself.
Yes, I wanted to inscribe what Jack just said. I mean, Gary was my first ecological Western inspiration, and for so many people of my generation, I had a gigantic hippie crush on him, of course, like everybody, and mainly what he was inspiring so many of us with were his lines and his his just fidelity to fresh language. And the way this poem works is so mysterious and so solid at the same time. It's it's full of monosyllables that are hard and crisp, and they do exactly what he's describing, and what Gary said earlier about putting a path down. It's ultimately a poem about writing and language, as well as other forms of work and being in the world. And so many uses of the monosyllable. And I love the way he's very irregular with the punctuation. There are these sort of random periods, and it's a creative collage of sounds. So I think all that we'll say this evening is so true. I mean, he is a massive culture hero, and a Buddhist and a spiritual leader and all of that. But we wouldn't be here if it weren't for his lines, and just the way he puts things next to each other. So I'm not surprised, John, that you spent a lot of the week listening. I was listening to him read Riprap as I took my walks, and it was incredible.
It is in the way that he uses language, mind work becomes similar to work. That when we work, we often make sounds and we interact with inanimate objects sometimes. And in his Zen practice, he obviously respects the entire world as having value in and of itself, not just humans. Rocks have sentience almost and value as well. Kim, you've published a book called Deer Trails, and Gary was talking about how much he learned about poetry and life being on trails. I wonder if there's any thread here you want to pick up from something that Gary said, or Jack and Brenda.
Well, my experience of Gary's work is probably different from a lot of the people here. My poetic tradition that I come from is prayer forms from Aniuya culture, my father's culture. And it has to do with transformation, but thinking about transformation, kind of muddling around in the spectacular debris that is what we think about. And one of the things I really love about Gary is that there's a sense of not just bringing the questions that we all sort of have to things like logging trails and deer trails, but also listening to the answers and not getting too caught up in expectation of what those answers will be and what they mean. So, sorry, my voice suddenly has decided to crap out. That I don't know if it's Buddhism or whatever else, but that part of the responsibility of poetics is to listen. And I find that in the work. So I always learn things from that.
Kim, you're also a bead worker, and I wonder if the way that Gary uses words in this particular book, which is different than some of his other books of poems, where he's trying to use a seemingly plain style with monosyllables, if the way that he's arranging words on the page mean anything to you in terms of your other craft as an artist, if it resonates.
Well, in my master's thesis, I managed to excuse some of the way that I bead by evoking poetics, because it's all an activity of assembling small pieces that may or may not have anything to do with one another. So yeah, to get to other answers,
Jack, I have a question for you. After you began to read Gary's poems, as a publisher, you're supposed to be the sober person in the room, getting the books out. But you also studied Zen Buddhism yourself, if I understand it correctly, and it also seemed to lead to a transformation. Did that change the way that you thought of publishing? As a practice, as an ethic?
That's a question I hadn't really thought of, but from the very beginning, I was publishing Gary and publishing Buddhist texts and some Christian texts. And it all seemed of a piece to me. It seemed like I had this path to travel on. And Gary gave me so many ideas for what that path might contain or where it might lead in terms of book publications. Because of Gary, I met Wendell Berry. Because of Wendell Berry, Wendell met Gary. So I had this confluence of opportunities and advice. But also you have to remember, in the 60s, it was a very small but extraordinarily lively scene. And I was able to go forward as a reader and finally as a book publisher on the advice of poets here, Robert Duncan and Robert Creeley, and as well as Gary and Wendell. So it was a very lively scene that I found myself a part of or integrated with. And the books, one book, as they always say, one book leads to another. And I was working with these men now for all these years. We're still working together. Gary and Wendell and I probably have 4 or 5 books in the pipeline each of things that we want to do and want to see out. So it's been a continuous education for me and an incredible opportunity that these men trusted me to publish their books without me having any credential. I was a high school student. I was a kid, and I simply had the idea that this was possible and why not do it? And no one told me that I couldn't, and so I did. I remember the first year of North Point's existence in 1980, we showed our books at the Booksellers Association in Chicago, the annual meeting. And the then director of Yale University Press came over to our booth. We had 2 books on the table in front of us. And she said, "Thank God you don't know you can't do this anymore." And I thought, well, thank God.
I want to bring in a comment from the audience. There's someone named Bill Corcoran who says, while these are poems of work and occupation, I see a deep continuous thread throughout Gary Snyder's poetry and prose and Buddhist practice, which is the uncovering of kinship. And I really love that idea because in addition to, we're going to be talking about the practice of the wild in a little bit, and after this, shortly, very soon, this group of poets will trade for another group of poets, and you can see in a Zoom already, there's 12 other people, and I will relay a fact from Jack Shoemaker's biography, which is that Gary Snyder also helped him choose the books in his early bookstores in California, which is yet another way that he sort of enriched the lives of others. Brenda, do you want to say anything about kinship and poetics in Gary's work, or in ways that his work led you to other poets?
Well, that's such an interesting question. I mean, I do think of kinship as we're speaking of it in the largest sense for Gary. And in fact, I was taking it back to language again, which the main thing for me really is Gary's language. And I think about the kinships that he brings, and I think we'll talk about it probably in the practice of the wild session, but just the kinships that he brings in the etymologies of the words themselves. And he shows the development of like how a word comes out through an ancient thread of Sanskrit into what our common usages are, and how language is such a living thing for Gary. And it seems so simple and plain, but it is so memorable and so unforgettable when you hear his lines, and in part because I think he lingers over the meanings of the words and their contexts and their relationships to each other. So that's the first thing about kinship that comes to me. And of course, what Peter was talking about in his talk about interrelationship with other beings and the land itself. And anyway, and I'm hoping we'll have time to read one more poem before the break, because I would love the audience to hear just the Sourdough Mountain poem, which starts
I adore that poem. Kim, do you want to read it, or do you want to read it, Brenda?
Well, Kim, do you have it in front of you?
I have the book. Why don't you read it, Brenda? I'm enjoying hearing you. This is the masterclass for me.
I was enjoying hearing you. Mid-August at Sourdough Mountain Lookout. Down valley, a smoke haze, 3 days heat after 5 days rain. Pitch glows on the fir cones. Across rocks and meadows, swarms of new flies. I cannot remember things I once read. A few friends, but they are in cities. Drinking cold snow water from a tin cup, looking down for miles through high, still air. Whoa. I mean, how he manages, excuse me, how he manages to make it so fresh that it lasts
for anyone who's listening, there's someone just put a whole essay in the chat about that particular poem. I agree. You could study that poem for years. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this group for now, so I'm going to ask Brenda and Kim and Jack, thank you for your contributions, and I'd now like to bring on Jane Hirshfield, Robert Haas, Rick Bass, and Wang Ping. Jane Hirshfield is the author of the Asking New and Selected Poems. Robert Haas, the poet, translator, teacher, former poet laureate, is the Pulitzer and National Book Award Prize winning poet of many books, including Summer Snow. Rick Bass, the writer, essayist, and activist, is the author of many books, including most recently with Every Great Breath, New and Selected Essays. And Wang Ping is the poet, photographer, multimedia artist, and retired McAllister professor. Congratulations on that stage of your life. Her latest book is My Name is Immigrant. I would like to start with you, Jane. Hearing Peter Coyote talk about Zen, hearing Gary talk about some of the backgrounds for those poems, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what it means for Zen to influence the way we use language, the way we tell poetry, the way we live.
Of course, and I'll begin just by saying what an honor it is to be part of this conversation and this celebration of Gary's starting point and then the prose midpoint. For me, I'm a little bit, younger than Peter and Jack, who read Gary from the very beginning. I discovered him when I was, I think, 18, 19 years old. He came to my college. He gave a reading in the coffee shop, but he also gave an East Asian Studies coffee hour talk about the Yamabushi mountain monks. And it was the first time that I had seen an American practitioner of Zen, in person. I knew my Buddhism. What I knew of it was from reading ancient Chinese and Japanese poems. And I think, Gary's particular gift to the language, to the culture, and to the understanding of the great many of us who ended up one way or another coming to Buddhist practice and coming to a poetics of interconnection, a great deal of that had to do with the way that he opened a gate of the possible in his language, in his body, in his example of being. And so, Riprap is organized as it was published with the Cold Mountain poems at the end. It is a kind of dialogue of two ways of speaking of Zen. First we have Gary's voice, and I think the organization of the book is really interesting to look at, but I won't detour into that. And then we have the voice of, the long ago mountain hermit monk speaking with equal humor and with equal groundedness in their own actual lives. But for an American, what Gary's work in particular brought was the sense of Buddhism, not only in the high granite aspects of understanding transience, of understanding interconnection, of understanding tender-hearted compassion, which will arise if you feel your life inseparable from other lives, if you don't define yourself as special or different from everything that we touch intimately and distantly. And here we have these poems, not of high granite, forgive me if you don't like this, Gary, I'm not sure, but of melange. So of the labor of trail building, the labor of working on freighters, the joy of eating food, the animal lives, the sympathy for horses that Gary himself mentioned, and especially also the diction of a kind of poem that had not existed before. So I love that Gary chose to read his poem with Milton, because that is such an example of unexpected mélange. We expect a reference to, when he says 10,000 years, we hear the echo of the classical Chinese poets and worldview. But when he brings in, right from the beginning of his work, Milton, we understand that this is a poet of West and of East, of non-separation, of understanding world culture as fully each person's own to draw from. The indigenous cultures, the labor, the classical traditions of both East and Western literary traditions. So all of that for me was a gate opening thing to discover at 20. I had no idea when I heard Gary that, 2 years later, I would be driving down the road to my own, monastic years of Zen practice. I didn't even know when I heard him that a monastery existed in America. But I think if I had not seen and heard his huge affection for the world and his inhabitants as a living American hippie with a ponytail and an earring, I would not have known that this was accessible to me as a person or as a poet. And I've talked long enough, so on to the next.
Oh, thank you so much, Jane. I wonder, Robert Haas, if I could ask you to come on. and talk a little bit more, because you've done some translating yourself. You once said that you became a poet, not a novelist, because you read Gary Snyder, and it seemed like the action was in the poetry, not in the novel writing world. But since we've been talking around the way that the juxtaposition of the Han Shan poems in the second half of this book and the mountain going, seafaring, trout eating, Berkeley life living poems of the first half, what is that juxtaposition? Was that a new kind of juxtaposition in American poetry, or was it something that was being reignited?
That's an interesting question, and I'm not sure I know the answer, or that two people would have who started reading at that time would have the same or different answers. There's an early poem of Robinson Jeffers that rejects what he thought of as Eastern ways of thinking. It's a poem saying the ocean in the brain is only the brain's ocean. Out there is the oceans. That was the hard-ass California nature aesthetic. And I'm not sure that I had any clue to the kind of intricate thinking that happens in Practice of the Wild, for example, about how one thinks about the idea of nature in Western poetry, and the idea of nature in that was implied by Gary's work with Han Shan. I have to say that during this period, at some point when I came to Berkeley to teach, I got to meet Ed Schaefer, the great Tang Dynasty scholar who was Gary's teacher. And I said, in whose class, I think, or just after, Gary did the Han Shan poems, which by then, Jack Kerouac, having published his novel based on his hiking with Gary, The Dharma Bums, became the idea that you should walk around with a copy of either a book of Basho or a book of Dufu or Han Shan in your pocket. It kind of became standard behavior for people on the beat hippie cusp. So I got to ask Ed Schaefer, I said, you were Gary Snyder's teacher? And he said, yes, he was much better than average intermediate student of classical Chinese. And I said, what about the Han Shan translations? And anyway, he said, amazing, but he had no notion that they had become the secret tea of a whole generation.
Gary Snyder has written himself about just the moving away from looking at nature as if it's this other thing, or the idea of beautifying from a distance and of reflection. And I think his style of writing into the natural world is really revolutionary still now. And, as someone who, as the author of Meditation at Lagunitas, which is one of the most amazingly beautifully placed poems of also the last 50 years, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how Snyder's poetics place us in California, in the West, and perhaps in ways that are different than had been done until then.
Yeah, there's well, it begins with Riprap, of course, which came to us, and those poems that came to us partly from Don Allen's anthology, which appeared around that time with the New American Poetry. The sense that there's a lot of new kinds of energy going on. And there were one or two other poets, the late poems of Theodore Rithke, for example, and the poems of Denis Levertov, that came into the same territory. Hard to convey to the young poets just starting now how disreputable Gary's poetic seemed. just at that moment. And also the way the layers of things that were going on in contemporary poetry that he brought together in poems that seemed totally simple. My experience is somewhere between Peter, Jane's, and Jack's, that just hearing those lines. I was in graduate school. Because I like to read, I thought I wanted to be a writer. I didn't know how or what kind. And then I saw Down Valley of Smoke Haze, 3 days heat after 5 days of rain, pitch clothes on the fern. And I thought, yeah, that's what I want. That life is what I want. And this sounds like life. It sounded to me, with my 1950s, 60s education, not unfamiliar because of William Carlos Williams and also because of Ezra Pound. And in fact, the jump in Gary's work in that time from Riprap through the Cold Mountain poems, in which he assimilated both a Taoist and Buddhist sensibility, to what I thought was the wild time. It's another thing to say, among all the confusing thoughts I'm having about this, that at the time, because of the stuff of the Beat generation, these poems, on the one hand, seemed like the poems of a wild guy of this wild new generation, who were, for Peter, Coyote, and me, probably older brothers and sisters, were the ones of the Beat era down there. That Gary's poetry, Gary was supposed to be a Beat poet, and therefore he was supposed to be a wild man. And here's this beautifully disciplined guy with an amazing ear, writing poems that sounded like nothing that was being written at the time. And lines, a hawk drifts into the far sky, a marmot whistles across huge rocks, rain on the California hills, mussels clamp to sea boulders, sucking the spring tides. It was, all the East Coast poets were busy writing about having a nervous breakdown. And Snyder was animating the whole world and making it seem suddenly totally alive. And without my knowing it, layering in I remember finding my way into the basement of City Lights and to a journal that Lawrence Ferlinghetti published called Journal for the Protection of All Being. I think Gary was in Japan at this time, and what was happening in this country was the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. There was terrific stuff going on. And in the midst of it, here is this essay called Buddhist Anarchism by the guy who had written Down Valley of Smoke Haze. And it meant layering Buddhist sensibility, the connection between Taoism and ecology. Nobody was making those connections. The anarchist and socialist sensibility of the Wobblies and the labor movement in the Pacific Northwest, his study, and that was what happens in the Berry Feast and then in Myths and Texts. The influence of Ezra Pound, I think, and the whole modernist effort to reinvent something like the mythologies of classical Greece and Roman poetry as poetry connected to the primitive. Gary was also, as everyone knows, studying Northwest Native American mythologies for his undergraduate thesis. The stuff he was drawing together at a time when the economic boom of the 1950s was causing clear cutting of Western forests was quite amazing. And so for a bunch of us, I think, for Jack, Peter, Jane, he was a curriculum as much as anything. And the surprise so Wallace Stegner was the one person who at Stanford who was connected to my thinking about environmental thinking and literature. And he had asked me, well, because the poetic atmosphere in my graduate school was pretty conservative. He said, who would you like to hear read? And I said, Gary Snyder, and he invited Gary Snyder. Gary, shut up, Jane. I also noticed, the first thing I noticed about Gary was that he's wearing an earring. Oh my God, he's wearing an earring. It's probably turquoise, it looks like, earring. And he came, the legendary, already famous Gary Snyder, and you realize that he's this incredibly intellectually disciplined human being who'd mastered a whole bunch of disciplines: ecology, forest ecology. He's thinking about Buddhism. He's not just talked about it, he went and did it. And for me, all of this was not reducible to, but funneled into just the absolute sureness and gorgeousness of the music of his poems.
Wow. I mean, we could transcribe that and make it into an essay. Robert Haas, I'm so grateful for you coming on. I want to take a bridge from some of what you've just said to a comment that Carol Duchamp says. Says, I'm a resident of Bolinas. Gary offered a point raised reading with a twist in perception regarding our West Coast, suggesting that, in fact, we live on the eastern shore of the Pacific Ocean. What more could be true? And I want to use this as a bridge to talk to you, Wang Ping. You've just translated, I believe, some of Gary's poems into Chinese, and as a Chinese speaker as well as writer, I think you could talk a little bit about the way that the Han Shan poems are interacting with the poems he himself is writing in English.
Right. Well, thank you. First of all, I have been translating Gary's poems into Chinese since the pandemic started. Everything seems pretty smooth until I came upon Riprap. This poem, every time I read it, it seems I'm home. But at the same time, when I try to translate it, it seems too much at home at first because the words are so simple, right? And so naked. And the Chinese poetics, right? You need something more beautiful, right? And so I translated, put it down, translated, put it down. I said, how can I make it more poetic, more beautiful, right? At the same time, I knew if I try to, I cannot try to change it. Otherwise, it's no longer Riprap. It's no longer Gary Snyder. Then 2 years ago, I think, yeah, 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, I was with Gary. I asked him, I told Gary this problem I'm having translating Riprap. Then he immediately went to his house is full of books, right? At the bottom, he tried to pull out those gigantic dictionaries to find the word riprap, right? And he was having a hard time seeking that word. And those dictionaries were pretty heavy, and Gary had shoulder issues, right? So he was like moaning, groaning, trying to carry the big books, dictionaries to the table to show me. And then Kai was not happy. He said, Gary, you should not carry these books, right? So the father and son was having a little like argument. And I started laughing. And then Gary finally found the book with a looking glass, and he was just so ecstatic when he found this book, and he started like telling me what it means, right? And suddenly the Confucius word, right? Confucius, who anthologized the first Chinese poetry anthology called Shi Jing, the Poetry Bible. And his first word is 正名, which is straighten the word. Then just suddenly I realized the riprap, adding what Gary told us, the meaning of the riprap, but riprap from the dictionary, I also saw that it's like just laying out those rocks, right, on the shore. right? Without cementing it with cement, without solidifying, to let the rocks do the work to protect the shore from being eroded by water, right? Immediately I thought about like when we build buildings, tall buildings, in the like earthquake zone, right? We have to make like to let loose. We cannot solidify the buildings with to enforce the buildings with like too much cement, or just basically to make room to let the building deal with the coming force, right? And immediately I just started laughing. I said, I found the key how to translate this poem. That is like, it explained like why I felt so close to Riprap is because it is embedded in Chinese poetics, right? That like use the bare words, right? The language wants to cover the essence, the fire, the true spirit of each word with a lot of decoration, right? And then make it grimy and make it cliche. And the poetry, actually, the job of poets is to shine, right? The word, each word is like a rock. We use our hands to move it while we're moving it and bring the rocks to the shore, or to make the walls that can combat the earthquakes. Is like we're cleaning the words, right? Cleaning up the rocks, right? Cleaning up the words to make a poem, right? And so that's why I felt like that's the key. Like this poem is the key to teach us how the universe, how like the cosmos is created, how a poem is created, right? And so like life is there with earthquakes, with the treasures, right? It's really up to us to like, do we want to make a burned out misery of pizza, or we make our own pizza with a touch of surprise, right? Which is also a 4-dimension game of Go, right? All the materials, raw materials is there. And Gary already showed us how to make a delicious pizza as a 4-dimension game of Go, right? So I went back into, after I laughed, right? I went back to the tatami room and finished the translation, which is just published in the Mongolia poetry magazine, and people just loved it. So I will read a little bit of this Chinese version. It's called 切实。在你的意识前，把词语一个个摆好，如同石头被双手固定在选好的位置，把意识定格在时间和空间，结实的树皮、树叶和墙，事物的堆砌，铺出鹅卵石的银河，走岔路的星球，这些诗，这些人，迷路的小马，拖着马鞍，在颠簸的山道上行走。这世界是一盘围棋，在四维的空间里永不休止。蚂蚁和鹅卵石嵌在薄薄的土壤，一石一字被溪水洗涤干净。花岗岩一条条纹理诉说火与重量的折磨，水晶与渣子融合，一切无常。我们的意识，我们的物质。Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wang Ping. I want to tell you and everyone who's not watching the chat that the Japanese translator of Riprap is also watching, and she's said that Gary has had a great influence on Japanese poets as well, and thanks you for a wonderful event. Several other people have pointed out that your definition of Riprap is also used where they're from. I want to bring back Gary as we move to Rick Bass. If Gary is still there, Rick, you know, I know that you and Gary have known each other for a very long time, and we've talked a lot about Gary's influence on poetics and on people's attitudes towards Zen, but I wonder if you can talk about your life as a essayist, as an advocate for forests in Montana, how Gary has influenced you and how your friendship has influenced you as much as his work.
Who?
I'm
Who's
talking about
influenced?
Rick Bass.
Who did he say?
Rick Bass, right here.
Oh, Rick Bass, yeah. What's the question?
I'm asking Rick how much your friendship has influenced his attitudes about ecology and preservation.
Ask him. What is it?
Okay, thanks, John and Gary and all of the panelists. What an amazing gateway as I knew it would be this evening. Brenda, your reading of Riprap was so perfect and wonderful. I mean, you could feel the words, each individual word being picked up like a rock and heavy, and then set down in the one place where it had to go. And Wang Ping, likewise, yours were. It was really wonderful to hear that difference. I could feel your hands pushing little rocks into place on that trail. And I want to thank Tom Lyon for asking me to read "Hay for the Horses" in Utah State a long time ago when I was there to play football and ski, not to read poetry. He didn't even say who wrote the poem. He just said, "Read this. It's a lovely poem." I did not know I'd leave Utah and end up in Montana, living in the forest among loggers who thought I was trying to put them out of work by being a tree hugger. And Gary, yeah, you've been an incredible mentor for me in that conversation. I want to say struggle, but it is a conversation. And like when Barry says, the people who know the most about trees are often the ones who cut them down and look at their insides and see, where are the growth rings compensating for darkness, for light, for nutrients, for moisture, for shade, for competition. And I think when I went to see you the first time, your chainsaw was in your bathroom. I just love that it was kind of like a holy relic. You were just taking really good care of it there, keeping it safe and warm and working on it. Yeah, it's been a great model for me to engage with people that you see as the opposition, who are the opposition, but to understand what they do and where they're coming from and how they do it.
Well, I got into that world when I was still a teenager, and the workers in the woods up in the Pacific Northwest had their chainsaws and they felled some pretty big trees, but they also knew exactly what they were doing. They knew what was wrong about it, and they could give a very useful and precise description of what better forestry would do. And they were on very good terms with the professional Forest Service people that came in, who were much younger and inexperienced, but who could learn from the loggers themselves how to go about it. That was one of the first things that I learned, was that it's not that you're in the woods, it's that you really are in the woods, and that's where you belong when you're doing that. And we can translate our life with the forests into something else, which is going on right now. And why? Because most of the working loggers in the West were leftists. A lot of them were actually Marxists. They were labor union people. My father, one of them. And they could talk quite intelligently about the economies of industry, agriculture, and the West. And they knew exactly what was going on, and they also knew that it would come to an end. And that is what we are witnessing and experiencing right now in terms of the forestry of the far west. So, you know, what I say about the woods is you have to be in the woods. Then you can do it.
Someone in the audience has pointed out that when the U.S. Forestry Service was planning the Tahoe National Forest, that Gary, you stood up at a public meeting in 1986 and said that they should plan for the next 1,000 years, not the next 15 years. I wonder, Gary, at this point, if you might want to say something about The Practice of the Wild, the other book that we've read for the book club.
You know, it is really a book about practice. It's hard to talk about it without going really into it, and the definitions and meanings and practices that I came to. But some of them were in the family that I grew up in, namely, be affectionate to your tools. Take good care of your car. Take good care of your truck. Keep your tools sharp. And that was both my father and my mother's way of seeing it and looking at it. And I absorbed that from childhood and learned how to sharpen an axe probably when I was about 10, and to do that without cutting myself. So if you are a working class person and you came up through the working class in some parts of the United States at any rate, it was a whole education which included politics and economics as well.
As you've been speaking, Gary, someone in the audience has been texting various lines from forestry work, including "keep those gunning marks aimed at your fall line." And his name is Eric Bruge. He also said, "keep that bar oil flowing, dog teeth sharp."
Good.
It's nice to know there are literary people with tools out there too. At this point, I think because we're running a tiny bit behind time, I'm grateful to everyone's patience. I'd like to bring on the second panel to talk about The Practice of the Wild. That includes Robert Haas will be coming back to read a brief excerpt. Will Hearst, who is the publisher of Alta magazine. You might know him on the West Coast as the former publisher of the San Francisco Examiner and the one-time managing editor of Outside Magazine. He's also the chairman of Hearst Publications. Jack Shoemaker will be coming back as the publisher of Counterpoint. And Kim, sorry, I got this wrong. It's Robert Haas, Will Hearst, Jane Hirshfield, and Peter Coyote. Bob, do you want to read something from the book?
Yeah, I could pick this up almost anywhere to read, but one place to start is near the middle in an essay or in a subdivision of an essay called "The World is Watching," which goes on to propose that one of the ways that we're deeply interconnected is that we eat each other. And that's why everything is watching everything. The world is watching. One cannot walk through a meadow or forest without a ripple of report spreading out from one's passage. The thrush darts back, the jay squalls, a beetle scuttles under the grasses, and the signal is passed along. Every creature knows when a hawk is cruising or a human strolling. The information passed through the system is intelligence. In Hindu and Buddhist iconography, an animal trace is registered on the images of the deities or Buddhas and bodhisattvas. Manjusri, the bodhisattva of discriminating wisdom, rides a lion. Samanta Mahabra, the bodhisattva of kindness, rides an elephant. Sarasvati, the goddess of music and learning, rides a peacock. Shiva relaxes in the company of a snake and a bull. Somewhere, tiny animals in their crowns or hair, in this ecumenical spiritual ecology, it is suggested that the other animals occupy spiritual as well as thermodynamic niches. Whether or not their consciousness is identical with that of humans is a moot point. Why should the peculiarities of human consciousness be the narrow standard by which other creatures are judged?
Oh, I'm so glad that you chose that particular section, because I think it gets to the heart of the way that Gary Snyder's ideas, his beliefs in Buddhism, lead to connections with how we treat the wild and the other living beings that occupy that space. And as Peter Coyote was saying, and much earlier, what that means ethically, what that means for our engagement, what that means for how we treat people and our ideas of equality. I want to ask a question now of Will Hearst. Will, you've known Gary for a very long time. You were at Outside Magazine in the 70s. Bob has talked a little bit about how the poems landed in the 1950s with Gary seeming to be this kind of wild man. When these sorts of essays were first being published, were they revolutionizing the way that people wrote about the outside in the 1970s? And what did that feel like as a reader when you were reading it the first time?
Yeah, I think I first met Gary because we had an op-ed idea at the newspaper, to sort of try and diversify something beyond letters to the editor and the editorial page. And I called up Gary kind of cold and I said, could you write something about the environment? And he wrote an essay that became part of his book, but I thought there was something very different in his voice because he was talking about the planet and the environment, but he was saying, you really need to start with something very close to you. What is your watershed? Are you really in touch with your immediate environment before you, give me some grand vision, or I will give you, you should know your immediate environment. So that was a very original point of view. Then I kind of met Gary a second time, kind of as a legendary figure in the Jack Kerouac novel, the Dharma Bums. And I was trying to reconcile these two Garys in my mind, this very sort of down to earth, original writer that you could just talk to, and then this other legendary figure. So I was talking to Jim Harrison, and I said, maybe we should do a profile of Gary. We should make a movie about Gary, kind of a New Yorker profile, but in the form of a movie. And I kind of had this idea, and I kept pitching Jim about it. He said, are you going to keep talking about this thing, or are you going to do something? And I said, well, I don't know if Gary wants to. He said, I'll call him, and I'll be the John Freeman of the movie. So we made this movie a couple of years ago, and it was another chance to sort of meet Gary as a human being, as an individual. And the movies, I put it on Vimeo so anyone can watch it. There's no charge to watch it. But one of the things that I rewatched the movie a couple of nights ago, and there's two things that when you make a movie, you're trying to think, like, am I going to engage the audience? People are going to watch it, and you're very busy making it. And then for the last couple of days, I started watching it, and I realized there were several components of this movie that really hit me. One of them was a kind of a dinner table conversation where Gary was trying to define the terms that he was using. And he said, when I use the word nature, I mean everything in the world that exists. That's nature. And when I use the word wild, I mean the parts of the world where human beings are not in charge. That's wild. That's the way I use these words. And that set of definitions has kind of invaded my brain. That's the way I now kind of, I kind of cloned Gary's vocabulary for that. There was another section in the movie where Jim Harrison was talking about writing poetry and building trails. And Gary said, well, I looked at writing a poem sort of like building a trail. I'm putting these rocks down that are these very simple objects, but I'm building a trail out of rocks. And when I'm building a poem, I want to use very simple words. I don't want to use highfalutin language, but I'm just going to use this sequence of words, and I'm going to make a trail. I'm going to make a thought trail. And so those were two things in the movie that really, I just can't get them out of my brain. There's just sort of, it's the Gary in my brain. I'll tell you one other thing that I hope Gary will forgive me for telling this story, but in the movie, Jim Harrison asked, Gary's wife had died relatively recently from the time we made the movie. And Jim asked him about it, and Gary said, I don't really want to talk about that. There's just parts of life that are so intense experiences that I'm just going to decline to amplify. But I needed time. You know, what happened to me, Gary was saying, what happened to me was I needed time in my life to just absorb the meaning of life and death and what this meant to me. And so that's what the movie says. But then a couple of months later, I went to visit Gary at Kitkadizzi, and he said to me, I want to show you, you know, where I lived and where my wife, this is the room that we were in. And I just sort of thought, oh, this is an amazingly, I don't know, it's not in the movie. The movie, he talks about the sensitivity of it, but I realized as a human being, he had tried to process this. And maybe that's Buddhism, maybe that's something else, but it made me think of him as an extraordinarily rounded person. It was not the legendary Jack Kerouac figure, was not just the professional writer. He was like a real human being. And that's the Gary I know. And it's been summarized by so many of you this evening, other fractions, you know, what Peter said and what Robert said and what his friends have said. But yeah, I'm very glad to be here. I sort of feel like he's just one of the most interesting people I've ever met.
Oh, thank you so much, Will. I want to ask Peter a question on the back of some of the things you just said, and it amplifies something that Jane Hirshfield said much earlier, which is that Gary is often bearing down upon words, and or maybe it was Brenda, sort of finding their old etymologies. He especially does that in the essays and Practice of the Wild, and he's sort of leading us to reconsider what the actual meaning of cultivate is, what the meaning of wild is, what the meaning of nature is. And by redefining these terms with enlarged meanings, he makes it possible to think of ourselves in a much wider frame, in a much longer time frame. And it occurs to me from your description, Peter, of that this is an inherently Buddhist practice of kind of but he's applying it towards language itself. Is there anything you could say about that in the context of these essays? That the way that he's looking at words and breaking them down and opening up spaces, is that similar to the thought practices that one enters in meditation?
I'm simply not sure. So what I wanted to talk about, which I'll do since I have the microphone, I wanted
Talk
to tell
about whatever you want.
I wanted to tell one quick story which bore on Gary's talking about the woods and the ethics of people who have to work in the woods and, you know, cut down trees that they revere and love. And we have had a mutual friend named Peter Bluecloud, who was a Mohawk poet and high iron worker and a painter. And when I'd go see Gary, I'd go to see Peter, and we'd sing cowboy songs together. And one day we'd had a few beers, and he said to me, "Are you pissed at me because I work in the woods and I cut down trees?" And I said, "No, I guess you have to." And he said, "Yes, I have to." He said, "I have a mortgage, I have bills to pay, I have a family, and this is my skill set. But let me tell you what I do." He said, "The mill owners push me to drop these big trees too fast. And when you drop them, they explode. And I just slow down and I make a bed of the branches. I make a cushion for those trees to fall on so they don't blow up." And I was impressed by that. I thought, okay, here's a guy who's caught in the jaws of the world, caught in the pressures of capitalism. He has a job to do. He has a family to take care of, but he would take the time to express his reverence for these trees by cutting limbs and making a padded place for the trees to fall. And that seems like the kind of divided life that we all have to lead to some degree. We're using electricity, we're using cars, we're using all this stuff. There's no pure place outside of all of it to stand. But in the midst of all this high-minded speech, I wanted to read one little quote. It's about my favorite quote of Gary's. It's from Etiquette of Freedom. And it's true, Gary is high-minded. Gary introduced me to Buddhism. Gary's taught me, given me most of the tools for everything I've done since we met. But I haven't heard a lot of talk about how much fun he is. Just plain foolish fun. And so from the Etiquette of Freedom, here's this quote. And when the children are safe in bed at one of the great holidays like the 4th of July, New Year's, or Halloween, we can bring out some spirits and turn on the music, and the men and the women who are still among the living can get loose and really wild. So that's the final meaning of wild, the esoteric meaning, the deepest and most scary. Those who are ready for it will come to it. Please do not repeat this to the uninitiated.
Oh, I love that. There is a lot in his work about sex, about
Yeah.
love, about dancing.
Yeah, he's an old mountain goat.
Jane, do you want to say anything about his sense of fun, play, tricksterism in his work?
Well, I'll say one brief thing about that, and then I'll be like Peter and say something else that I was thinking about. So for the fun, I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the poems in Riprap, the comedy of some of them, the Thin Ice poem is, he has the sense of the comic from the beginning, the sense of trickster from the beginning. And this is a sign of basic humility. If you can see the humor of the world and you can see the humor of your life, you cannot be arrogant, you cannot be ego-centered, because to be able to laugh and to sing and dance and love to drink and love to, all those other things, that is the sign of somebody who is not only interested in power. What Gary, one of his fundamental qualities is curiosity. To this day, I saw him a couple of weeks ago at Kitkadizzi, and he remains investigatory of the world. He's still asking questions. And if you ask questions rather than only make declarations, then you are a human being, because that is so close to our nature. The other thing that I wanted to bring in was, well, there were many things I wanted to bring in. A couple of the quotes that have come to mind is Gary saying, and I'm not sure it's in this book, it's from somewhere, poetry is very high quality information. And I think that is both, funny and profoundly true. The definition of the wild that I remember him saying when he was, when I was invited to teach with him during the Art of the Wild conferences, was he said, well, human beings were still a wild species because we mate freely. That's a great definition of the wild rather than the domesticated. And in the section in Practice with Wild on Culture, he says, don't think of culture as being a word that means elite, a cultured person. It doesn't mean elite. Think of it in the terms of cultivation and agriculture in the natural world. She is well fertilized. And that's pretty funny. But this non-distinction between our human activities of logging, of mining, and the rest of existence, this is the continuity between the mole and the miner. We are a wild being doing what we do. And recognizing that, I think, is so close to the deep ethos and ethics of what Gary has brought us all to. I wanted to give you a couple more of his words because there's something distinctive which also hasn't been named, along with the other sometimes under-recognized things, the craftsmanship of the poems, the alliteration, the sound, the music, the distinctiveness of his music, the comedy, the love of life, the joy. I wanted to bring in how he always looks at things from unexpected directions, and this is part of what makes him such a good teacher. So the very last section of The Practice of the Wild is the section called Grace, which is talking both about, literally saying grace when you eat, recognizing the sacredness of our participation in the world where one being eats another. So I'm going to read you a little tiny section of that. There's a verse chanted by Zen Buddhists called the Four Great Vows. The first line goes, "Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to save them. Shugo Muhen Sekando." It's a bit daunting to announce this intention aloud to the universe daily. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to save them. This vow stalked me for several years and finally pounced. I realized that I had vowed to let the sentient beings save me. In a similar way, the precept against taking life, against causing harm, doesn't stop in the negative. It is urging us to give life, to undo harm. And then skipping ahead a little bit, eating is a sacrament. The grace, we say, clears our hearts and guides the children and welcomes the guest all at the same time. We look at eggs, apples, and stew. They are evidence of plenitude, excess, a great reproductive exuberance. There's the joy Peter was talking about. Millions of grains, and on it goes. And I wanted to comment again because, books are structured things. They are not accidental. And that this book ends by speaking about grace feels to me attuned to my own understanding of what reply can we make to the world's suffering, in which we are participants, which we see all around us ever increasingly. The destruction of the planet's biosphere that Gary wrote about in a book that comes out in 1990. Rachel Carson wrote about in 1949. We have always known what we need to know now. It's almost 35 years later. And here we are immersed in, at least now more people are noticing the suffering. But there are two answers to suffering. One, as Gary says, the undoing of harm, and the other, as this book enacts and demonstrates, the recognition of grace, the praise of the great beauty and plenitude and joy of the world. And that is part of the antidote to despair that I find in Gary's work, and that he taught us all so long ago and continuing now.
Oh, thank you, Jane. Since you mentioned grace, I feel like we're nearing the end of this very beautiful meal of time together. And I want to invite Wang Ping and Kim and Rick Bass and Jack Shoemaker and Brenda back, and Gary too, if you're still there, just so that we can all be on the same screen together. And I've been guiding the chat up until this point, but there was one. I don't want to turn you, Gary, into a human jukebox where poems are called out. That was for bar 6 many years ago. But there wasn't a question from the audience about what is everybody's favorite Gary Snyder poem. And I think maybe I should ask you first, Gary. Is there a poem of yours that you wrote that feels as close to what you wanted to do as it ever got?
Not really, because 8 or 10 of those poems each have their own place. And so it's a matter of the right place, the right poem for the right place. But I don't think that I have one single poem that I would say covers it all.
Someone has just called out changing diapers, and because you use the simile of baby toes like peas.
Well, those are very nice.
The bath.
Nothing wrong with that.
And someone else is calling out the axe handles. Wang Ping, you've known Gary a very long time. Is there anything you would like to ask of him before we close out tonight?
So Gary, I'm ready to make a film out of your riprap. And so I've been thinking really hard about poetics, the entanglement, the riprap, all those rocks and the words you use, and then our brain, how our brain runs, so similar to to all the stars and the constellation. So yeah, so if you have any advice how to make this film on your riprap successful, I would love to start from there. Sorry, it's been taking, I promised you to make this film last year, but I've been really busy racing around the world. So, but I'm ready.
Well, I'm happy to hear that. And I am not entirely sure I can be really helpful to you because I think in different situations, and different tools.
Right.
But I would be quite happy to work with you if you want to try and make it all match.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's for Chinese, right?
Yeah. This will be both English and Chinese. By the way, the Chinese anthology is almost done, and I'm going to print it out and send it to you.
Okay.
And, yeah. So we'll talk.
Yeah, I like your Chinese.
Okay.
Yeah.
I like your English and Chinese too. You still remember those Chinese, right?
Yeah.
I really enjoy, by the way, I really enjoy translating your Han Shan poem, your translation of Han Shan poem.
Well, I'm happy to do that too.
Yeah, translating them back into Chinese, it's quite a trip. And the Mongolia Poets editor, she loved them. So
Oh gosh.
I know she really enjoyed reading those translation of translation. So it's quite a circling, coming round and round, coming back, homecoming.
Okay.
Yeah. So
There's a lot of circles here. Someone in the audience began reading your poems 50 years ago at Reed College. Since we're talking about films, Will, is there anything that you would like to ask Gary while we're all together?
Sure. What are you working on next?
Oh my goodness. I'm working on a project that's really a little bit too big, but maybe I can do something with it. We talk about spirit, about all of the life and spirit of nature on all sides in every parts of the planet, and we never quite get them all together. And I'm trying to imagine a way to talk about the spiritual powers and complexities of the entire natural system that we are surrounded by. And if I can find a way to do that, it will be very, very nice to make.
Nothing too ambitious, Gary. Nothing too ambitious.
That's what I think too.
I want to ask Jack Shoemaker if he has any advice here as a longtime editor / publisher.
Advice? I think Gary probably needs a nap. So I'm not much advice he needs at this stage, but I would sure love to have him or somebody read Axe Handles. That seems to me a poem that kind of summarizes a lot of what we've talked about this evening. Do you feel
Does anybody have axe handles handy in front of them? Gary, do you have it nearby?
Oh, you mean just that one poem?
Just that one.
Yeah.
Maybe. Which book is it in?
Axe handles.
Called axe handles.
I have it.
It's on the internet.
You want me to read it or Gary going to read it?
What book is it in?
I don't know that. I just called it up online.
It's
in
on,
Handles. But Kai, are you there, Kai? Do you have
It's
a
on-
copy
Yeah,
there?
I'll get it. Han
I
Shan.
have it.
it's on the internet.
I have it.
We collected it's
Yeah,
in 383.
I think that Gary might want to, you want to read it, Gary?
Sure.
It doesn't help that the collected is this big.
Okay.
Okay, we got it here. Axe handles. One afternoon, the last week in April, showing Kai how to throw a hatchet. One half turn, and it sticks in a stump. He recalls the hatchet head without a handle in the shop and go gets it and wants it for his own. A broken off axe handle behind the door is long enough for a hatchet. We cut it to length and take it with the hatchet head and the working hatchet to the wood block. There I begin to shape the old handle with the hatchet and the phrase first learned from Ezra Pound rings in my ears. When making an axe handle, the pattern is not far off. And I can say this to Kai, look, we'll shape the handle by checking the handle of the axe we cut with. And he sees, and I hear it again. It's in Luke G's 4th century AD essay on literature in the preface. In making the handle of an axe by cutting wood with an axe, the model is indeed near at hand. My teacher, Hirshfield Chen, translated that and taught it years ago. And I see Pound was an axe, Chen was an axe, I am an axe, and my son a handle, soon to be shaping again. Model and tool, craft of culture. How we go on.
Brilliant, brilliant.
Obvious.
Maybe the second thing you should work on is being a stand-up comedian, Gary Snyder. It's been a pleasure to share this time with you. All of us want to thank you for coming on to the California Book Club.
Well, thanks to everyone for showing up and being here, and we could go on.
Well, thank you, Will Hearst, Robert Haas, Kim Shuck, Jack Shoemaker, Jane Hirshfield, Rick Bass, Wang Ping, Brenda Hillman, Peter Coyote, the folks at Alta magazine, and mostly, especially Gary Snyder for making this incredibly special night. I hope you go out there, enjoy your lives, get up to some fun, enjoy your bioregions, read some more Gary Snyder, and have a wonderful night, everyone. I think Blaise will come on now to walk us out.
Well, gosh, thank you. That was just such an honor, such a great evening. I mean, I'll never forget it. And tonight's program was recorded. It will be up on our website later tonight or first thing in the morning. So please come back and watch it. And everyone who registered, you'll get an email with links to all the things that were discussed tonight and a recap. Please be sure to join us next month for Javier Zamora's Solito. That will be on June 20th. And in the meantime, please don't forget our special offer of joining Alta as a member. For $50 a year, you get 4 issues, unlimited access to the website, a fantastic hat, and the best bookstores guide. And please support our partners, because without them, evenings like this would not be possible. And we also have different price points too. If $50 is too much, $3 a month gets you a digital membership as well. So please visit altaonline.com. And finally, we'd be grateful if you would participate in a 1-minute survey that will pop up on your screens as soon as the event ends. So again, thank you everyone for tuning in tonight. We have people from Mexico, Brazil, Thailand, Wales, the UK, Scotland, Hawaii, China, Japan, Canada, I mean, everywhere. I mean, it's all for you, Gary, and just thank you so much. And belated happy birthday to you. I know
Happy
you celebrated last week.
birthday.
Happy birthday, Gary.
All right.
Happy birthday, Gary.
All right. Good night, everyone, and thank you so much.
Bye.
We'll see you next month. Take good care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Beautiful.
Bye.